In 1945, Vietnam stood on the edge of a profound turning point. The Japanese surrender created a sudden power vacuum, opening the door to national revolution, but also to imperialist restoration. The Viet Minh, a loosely organized coalition led by the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, had spent years navigating a delicate strategy, seeking support from imperial powers while cautiously building the basis for mass resistance. But events overtook them. Across the country, a spontaneous people's uprising surged ahead of official party plans, driven by famine, oppression, and hopes for land and liberation. This video explores the complex and often contradictory forces at play in Vietnam during the closing months of World War II, when colonial collapse, revolutionary aspiration, and geopolitical maneuvering collided. We'll trace how Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh struggled to harness a popular movement that often exceeded their control, how imperialist powers maneuvered to restore authority, and how a war supposedly fought for freedom exposed the deep hypocrisies of Allied intentions. By the end, what emerged was not only a brief moment of independence, but the first chapter in a 30-year war that would defeat both France and the United States. This is the story of Vietnam's August Revolution, a moment where the Second World War fractured into two parallel wars, one imperial, one popular, and they collided on Vietnamese soil. Shortly after the Second World War officially concluded, General Vuong Nguyen Giap of the Vietnamese Liberation Army met with General Leclerc, often referred to as the Liberator of Paris. Giap expressed his feelings by saying, "The first resistance fighter of Vietnam is happy to meet the first resistance fighter of France." In 1946, the French returned to bombard the port of Haiphong, resulting in the deaths of 6,000 civilians in an attempt to reclaim their previous power. Vietnam's resistance lasted 3 decades, ultimately driving out the French and even humbling America, the world's dominant superpower. The stark difference between Giap's inspiring words and the harsh reality of the warfare he initiated illustrated the complicated nature of the Second World War. Was it a battle for true freedom, or merely a means to uphold existing authority? French Indochina included Vietnam's 3 provinces, Tonkin in the north, Annam in the center, and Cochinchina in the south, along with Cambodia and Laos. France publicly insisted that its officials in these regions were engaged in an immense task for the sake of the Indochinese population. Yet the narrative in Paris was strikingly different. No country in the world offers as many resources. There are so many industries to be created, so many brilliant financial operations to be performed. So what are you waiting for? Go ahead. By the 1930s, these brilliant financial endeavors had concentrated 2/3 of the colony's production in foreign hands and ensured that European civilians earned an income 102 times that of the local peasants. Such a system relied heavily on military force, with over half of the 42,000 European residents being soldiers. The effects of this colonial history on the Second World War are a matter of debate. The Indo-Chinese Communist Party believed that the emergence of a local ruling class was so stunted that significant social divisions among the Vietnamese had disappeared. Ho Chi Minh, its leader, claimed he was following the guidance of the Communist Manifesto, where it stated that the proletariat of each nation should build itself into a national class and become national. If this were accurate, it would negate the possibility of a grassroots uprising with its social and economic implications, and would turn Marx's famous call for unity among workers upside down. However, the ICP's belief that communism could be seamlessly intertwined with patriotism was fundamentally flawed. Despite their small numbers, wealthy Vietnamese landowners and entrepreneurs had a per capita income that surpassed that of European civilians, being 122 times greater than that of the peasant class. The Second World War intensified this social divide in multiple ways. Cut off from France, the colony had to appoint its own administrators, leading to a doubling of middle and senior positions. By 1944, 75 out of 92 corporations were managed by Vietnamese. The French had intentionally empowered local landlords to create a supportive social base for their regime, with just 6,200 individuals owning 45% of the rice-growing land in the south. In the Red River Valley, a mere 2% of households held 50% of the land. The war brought along rising food prices, hoarding, speculation, huge profits for a select few, and severe hardship for the majority. While acknowledging the social aspect, it does not diminish the significance of the national struggle. From 1941, Vietnam was under the thumb of not just one, but two imperial powers. Japan saw Vietnam as a crucial base for its campaign in China. While Japan replaced European administrations in various regions, in Indochina, it formed an agreement with Vichy France. Governor-General John Decoux, a staunch supporter of Pétain who targeted Jews and Gaullists, was allowed to stay in power in exchange for permitting Japanese military bases. Vichy diplomats viewed it as a miracle to maintain a peaceful and prosperous island of Western civilization amidst Japanese control. Remarkably, when France was liberated, de Gaulle kept Decoux in his position, fearing that disrupting his regime might invite Chinese and their American allies to intervene even more than he disliked the Pétain supporters. Consequently, the Free French government in Paris must bear the blame for the famine in Tonkin in 1945. Like other famines in history, this one was orchestrated. Fair food distribution could have prevented starvation, despite poor weather and pests causing a 1/5 reduction in the northern rice harvest. However, the French army transported 10 or more boatloads of rice out of the stricken area daily. Local hoarders and speculators made matters worse. In Hanoi, the capital of Tonkin, food prices skyrocketed by 373% in just 3 months. Officials reported witnessing corpses lying along the roads, emaciated and dressed in little more than a bit of straw, their only burial garments. It left one feeling ashamed of humanity. Estimates suggest the death toll could be as high as 2 million. Then, the Japanese dismantled what remained of French authority. In November 1944, as the United States prepared to reclaim the Philippines, Japan's Southern Army moved its general headquarters from Manila to Saigon, taking full control of Vietnam on March 9th. This takeover by Tokyo had far-reaching political consequences, though those suffering from famine experienced little change as grain requisitions persisted. The Japanese reinstated the Annamese Emperor Bao Dai in his palace in Hue, granting him the illusion of independence and limited powers over Vietnam. By aligning with the Axis powers, Bao Dai and the nationalist parties that collaborated with him forfeited their chances for leadership in any future struggle for independence. This created an opportunity for the ICP to emerge as the uncontested leader in the fight for freedom. Nonetheless, the ICP did not arrive at this role easily. Its strategy slowly shifted from loyalty to the Allies to outright conflict with them. To grasp the reasons behind this transition, one must trace the party's complex journey, influenced by French oppression and Stalinist politics. The ICP's founding declaration in 1930 aimed for the complete independence of Indochina, seeking to overthrow French imperialism, Vietnamese feudalism, and the reactionary bourgeoisie. The ICP intended to seize all plantations and properties owned by imperialists and the Vietnamese bourgeoisie, redistributing them to impoverished peasants. However, these ambitious goals posed significant challenges for the party from the outset, and that same year, the defeat of the Nghe Tin Soviet movement resulted in the arrest of thousands of communists. A decade later, the ICP pledged allegiance to the Communist International's Popular Front strategies, which stood in stark contrast to its earlier stance. It was advised to avoid making extreme demands like national independence or parliamentary representation, as that would only benefit the Japanese fascists. Instead, it should focus on claiming democratic rights, ensuring freedoms of organization, assembly, press, and speech, advocating for a general amnesty for political prisoners, and securing the party's right to operate legally. To achieve this goal, the party needs to work towards creating a wide democratic national front. This front should include not just people from Indochina, but also progressive French individuals living there. It should unite the working class along with the national bourgeoisie. The party must maintain a careful and adaptable approach to the national bourgeoisie, seeking to involve them in the front and ensure they remain committed. While the national bourgeoisie may now be seen as allies, Trotskyists, who still supported policies that the ICP itself had famously backed in 1930, became adversaries. There was no room for compromise or concessions. The focus was to expose them as agents of fascism and politically eliminate them. Despite adjusting its strategies and attempting to reach out to the French, the ICP fell victim to anti-communist repression that followed the Hitler-Stalin Pact. Arrests disrupted communication within the party, and the central leadership lost the solid authority typical of communist organizations. Leadership failed to prevent members from participating in futile revolts against the French in places like Bacson in the north and Cochinchina in the south. During the latter, the collective was crushed using aircraft, armored vehicles, and artillery, leading to the destruction of entire villages. With a shortage of handcuffs or chains, detainees had their limbs bound with telegraph wire. When prisons overflowed, the French crammed detainees onto boats anchored in the Saigon River. The exact number of deaths during this White Terror remains unknown, but likely exceeded 2,000, with up to 8,000 detained, many later perishing in jail or facing execution. In contrast, 3 French individuals and 30 local Vietnamese notables lost their lives. Such events deepened the ICP leadership's apprehension about engaging in a people's war. To illustrate the challenges faced, Ho Chi Minh had to live abroad from 1911 to 1941 under various aliases. A prominent anti-colonial figure criticized him, saying they shouldn't live in exile but should return home to lead. Ho argued that this was futile since local fighters faced close surveillance and fierce pursuit on their own land. His perspective shifted during the Second World War when he expressed in his letter from abroad that the moment for liberation had finally arrived. France cannot assist its colonialists in governing our country. As for the Japanese, they are entangled in China and hindered by British and American forces, which prevents them from fully directing their strength against us. If our people unite completely, we can prevail over the highly trained armies of both the French and the Japanese. Fellow countrymen, rise up. Progress, however, remains slow. Even on the brink of seizing power in the August 1945 revolution, the party had only around 5,000 members, a significant portion of whom were imprisoned. The party's military force was similarly small. Meanwhile, the Japanese maintained 57,000 troops in Vietnam, alongside thousands more experienced Allied forces ready to suppress any independence movement following the war. In light of these circumstances, the Vietnamese ICP embraced a cautious approach. Ho advised against rash mass actions, believing they could scatter our resources. Instead, he proposed a 3-phase strategy modeled after the Chinese Communist Party. Initially, party members would set up a revolutionary base in a remote area. Next, they would recruit peasants, and finally the party would strike at the towns to seize power. Ho Chi Minh, having spent years with the Comintern, still paid lip service to the working class but practically sidelined mass movements and dismissed urban workers. The first step in his plan was creating an armed propaganda brigade for the liberation of Vietnam, which signaled their ultimate goal but deliberately avoided direct conflict. Ho stated that the title highlighted the precedence of political action over military action. Then, in May 1941, the decision was made to form the Vietnam Doc Lap Dong Minh, or Viet Minh. Mar explains how this brought together workers and peasants, along with landlords, capitalists, officials, soldiers, intellectuals, clerks, and shopkeepers, all increasingly disturbed by the unacceptable actions of the French and Japanese. They were ready to fight for Vietnam's liberation and align themselves with those who would come to call themselves the Allies. The cost of seeking alliance with this faction, which included de Gaulle's supporters, was the postponement of working class and poor peasant demands in favor of a broader national liberation movement. As a result, the Viet Minh rejected land redistribution, which was essential since it affected the livelihoods of 90% of the population. Neal suggests that the position of the Communist Party of Vietnam can be attributed to its social roots. Initially, it recruited educated individuals who then guided the villagers they were familiar with. These individuals were part of the landlord class, but despised its corruption and brutality. They aimed to dismantle the old order and create a modern industrial state, leading to the Communist Party's ongoing ambivalence regarding land reform. Ho Chi Minh's attempts to create a cross-class alliance were so intense that outside observers often questioned whether he was truly a communist. For instance, the Times reported that there were basically two significant parties at the time, the Viet Minh and the Communists. Ho's strategy extended to the formal dissolution of the Communist Party in November 1945, an unprecedented move in the context of the international communist movement. However, adjusting policies did not ensure Allied support. With the Soviet Union unattainable, Ho turned to warlords affiliated with Chiang Kai-shek, the Chinese nationalist leader, who operated near the Sino-Vietnamese border and could offer weapons and refuge if needed. In search of their backing, he set up in a cave in Cao Bang in February 1941. The fragility of Ho's situation became evident when he was captured for a year by a previously cooperative warlord. Due to the unreliability of Chinese support, he sought other means of assistance. At one point, he even expressed willingness to negotiate with the French, who were genuinely committed to resisting the Japanese. General Giap reached out to Commander Rohl of France, but a formal agreement remained out of reach. American aid presented a more promising alternative, with indications that the U.S. might support the Viet Minh and resist the return of French colonialism. When Roosevelt discussed Vietnam with Stalin at the Tehran Conference in 1943, they were in complete agreement that France should not regain control in Indochina. The president mentioned that the USA was contemplating a system of trusteeship with its Chinese counterpart, aimed at preparing the populace for independence within a set time frame, possibly 20 to 30 years. This kind of paternalism aligned with post-war ambitions, as Europe's Asian territories were to be opened up and placed under America's significant economic sway, with four powers, Russia, Britain, the USA, and China, governing globally. France was not yet included in this vision. However, American support for the Viet Minh would prove to be fleeting. As World War II came to an end, the climate of the Cold War began to shift. Chiang's nationalist regime crumbled, while de Gaulle's France became essential to countering Russian influence in Europe. Thus, just 4 days before his passing in April 1945, Roosevelt abandoned his trusteeship proposal. By May, the United States Secretary of State was falsely asserting that the government had not made any official statements questioning French sovereignty over Indochina. These fluctuations in United States policy created a sense of confusion in East Asia. For instance, the United States Air Force conducted numerous missions to support the French during their short-lived fight against Japan's coup. Yet soon after, OSS agents collaborated with Ho Chi Minh, even recruiting him as an agent, while a team led by Major Allison Thomas was sent to train Viet Minh fighters. Although the United States provided only 12% of the weaponry, the psychological boost for the Viet Minh was significant, as they became linked with the victorious Americans. By victory over Japan Day, the United States had clearly shifted to backing French claims and distancing itself from Ho. Major Thomas, positioned to oversee the Japanese surrender in Hanoi, was instructed by his superiors that he was not to do so under any circumstances. He found this news shocking and deeply discouraging, but understood the reasoning. America could not appear to cooperate with Ho, as the French were considered allies, and the Viet Minh were seen as a clandestine group opposing them. Thus, despite his efforts, Ho was unable to secure sustained support from any of the key allies, France, China, or the United States. However, his strategy remained focused and closely tied to an anticipated Allied landing. As late as March 12, 1945, the Central Committee of the ICP stated that we shouldn't just wait for the Allied forces to establish a base. We also need to hold out until they start making advances. At the same time, we must wait for the Japanese to deploy troops to the front in order to intercept the Allies, which would expose their rear, before we initiate a widespread uprising. However, Ho's strategy was not strictly tied to imperialist plans. He wasn't so naive as to accept proclamations like the Atlantic Charter without question, and while waiting for the Allies, he also envisioned a mass movement to oppose any attempt to reinstate French rule. Meanwhile, the Viet Minh largely steered clear of direct confrontations with Japanese forces. Between March and May, Their activities resulted in the loss of about 50 Japanese soldiers. Some argue that the Japanese viewed this as an inconvenience, but nothing close to the resistance seen in Yugoslavia or from the Chinese Red Army. The few skirmishes were merely isolated incidents. There wasn't enough combat to be termed an armed struggle. Everything changed when Japan faced an impending defeat, creating a power vacuum that allowed the desires of everyday Vietnamese to emerge. The Viet Minh, despite its small size and focus on well-structured military units, became the focal point for a people's war in the north and a significant force in the south. Marr elaborates on the intricate relationship between the grassroots popular movements and the limited group of communists. While many of the upheavals in August were ignited by Viet Minh slogans, crafted or approved by seasoned ICP members, and nearly everyone aligned themselves with the Viet Minh banner, which would soon become the national symbol, many local factions calling themselves Viet Minh were largely unaware of the organization's actual principles, not to mention lacking ties to the general headquarters. The numerous people's committees and revolutionary committees that replaced the various royal officials and appointed councils were not just simple extensions of the central authority or mere fronts for ICP members. Many of these groups sought to avenge past wrongs or expressed radical social revolutionary ambitions. The People's War unfolded because the official ICP policy was largely ignored by the masses. Rejecting the politics of class compromise, many pushed for land redistribution, sparking a property upheaval that no government could manage. The French authorities in Tonkin observed an alarming trend, noting that while there were just 4 Viet Minh incidents between 1942 and 1943, that number surged to 80 in 1944. In famine-affected areas, the local Viet Minh rallied the pressing need for grain, leading to demonstrations armed with spears and machetes. Over 75 warehouses in the Red River Delta felt the impact. By summer 1945, the growing discontent reached a peak, prompting the ICP to take action. In June, the Viet Minh proclaimed a liberated zone in the north, with 100,000 people, about 1 in 10 residents, joining its militia, while the rest of the country only counted 80,000 supporters. On August 12th, they called for a general uprising, followed by Military Order No. 1 the next day, which initiated an attack on the Japanese to seize their weapons. Yet, the ICP struggled to manage the ongoing People's War effectively. The vast distance of 1,650 kilometers across the country meant that from late 1940 to June 1945, there was no direct communication between the leadership in the north and those in Cochinchina. Competing movements in the south challenged Viet Minh leadership. One was the Vanguard Youth, a group initially inspired by French scouting and sports, which became political due to war. Although it boasted a large following, it lacked the Viet Minh's unity, hindered by the diverse political and religious factions within it. Another rival was Trotskyism, which opposed the ICP's strategy of forming a cross-class alliance in stages, arguing instead for a clear choice between socialism and nationalism. This perspective garnered significant support in Cochinchina, even surpassing the communists in the 1939 Colonial Council elections. The Trotskyist leader, Tu Thu Thao, dismissed the idea of combining communism with patriotism, asserting that the real divide lay between the exploiters and the exploited rather than among capitalist nations. In Vietnam, workers and peasants confronted a dual threat, colonialism combined with the native bourgeoisie. Tu Thu Thao viewed the Second World War as a chance to leverage the conflict among capitalist nations to liberate the working class. For this to succeed, clear demands from the working class needed to be articulated. However, Japan's unexpected surrender disrupted Ho Chi Minh's plan to work alongside the advancing Allied forces as a path to power. The Viet Minh did emerge victorious, but the sequence of events unfolded differently than the leaders anticipated. Tonneson notes that in August, the ICP found itself sidelined just as the opportunity for a traditional urban revolution arose. In places like Hanoi and Hue, the August Revolution occurred spontaneously, driven by passionate youth and lower-level activists, while party leaders remained in their secluded war capital of Tan Trao. It was the Nationalist Democratic Party in Hanoi that initiated the first mass gathering on August 16th, emphasizing that only a revolution by all citizens could thwart the ambitions of the imperialist powers. However, they were outmaneuvered by a Viet Minh supporter who took the stage and rallied the crowd for her organization. Being the only well-organized party in the revolutionary landscape, the ICP and its Viet Minh Front quickly regained lost ground. Ignoring the central leadership's cautious approach, the Communist Regional Committee called for a power grab. On August 19th, a crowd of 200,000 succeeded while demoralized Japanese troops stood by. Contrary to Ho's beliefs, it was the actions in the cities that inspired the rural activists, leading many from the countryside to seek guidance in Hanoi, followed by thousands of villagers. Simultaneously, the revolution exceeded the limitations set by ICP policies. Mar observes that although the Viet Minh leaders aimed to avoid radical demands, events in various rural districts during late August transcended a mere political power shift, leading to unpredictable social revolutionary actions. The administration established by the Viet Minh in Hanoi found itself constrained by the numerous revolutionary committees emerging across the nation. The differences emerging between the people's perception of the Second World War's purpose and the ICP's stance raised questions about land. On July 30th, 1945, the party reaffirmed its position, emphasizing the preservation of existing land ownership. They stated that once the revolution succeeded and the country achieved independence, the land owned by the wealthy wouldn't be redistributed to the poor. Only the land and assets of aggressors and traitors would be confiscated. Those advocating for the redistribution of wealthy land were seen as dividing the people's united front and deserved punishment. However, the revolution disregarded these rules. In North Annam and Tonkin, committees allocated land and seized wealth from the rich. Additionally, 30,000 miners formed a workers' commune, establishing equal pay and taking control of mines, public services, railways, and telegraphs. This organization lasted until the Viet Minh arrested its leaders in November 1945. The situation was even more complicated in the south, where competition was fierce. After Japan's surrender, local communists mobilized in a village 40 kilometers from Saigon, planning to approach later. Yet, 100,000 people marched through the Cochinese capital under the banner of a united national front, with the vanguard youth leading the charge. It seemed for a moment that the ICP had completely lost the initiative. In this chaotic environment, Trotskyist slogans gained traction. Land to the peasants, nationalization of factories under workers' control, people's committees. These demands resonated with and inspired the landless populations in provinces like Mitho, Treving, Sadek, Longshuyan, and Chowdak. Workers in the Phunuan district asserted their committee as the sole legal power in the area, a move that spread elsewhere. Within 3 weeks, over 150 independent revolutionary committees were formed. However, the ICP, rooted in Stalinist ideology, was not prepared to cede the South to others. On August 25th, after 500,000 marched through Saigon, a Southern Provisional Executive Committee was created to consolidate the various factions into one entity. The Viet Minh quickly maneuvered to secure the majority of positions before turning against their rivals. Ho Chi Minh enforced a harsh policy with the harsh warning that those who didn't adhere to his directives would face severe consequences. Among the early victims was Ta Tu Thao. While attempting to control the revolution, Ho also reached out to the imperialists. On September 2nd, he delivered the Declaration of Independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam from Hanoi. He began by quoting the United States Declaration of 1776 and followed that with phrases from France's 1791 Declaration of the Rights of Man. Ho expressed confidence that since the Allied nations had recognized the principles of self-determination and equality, they would not deny the independence of a people who had fought alongside them against fascism. Meanwhile, in Cochinchina, Tran Van Jiao, the leader of the Provisional Executive Committee, discouraged mass mobilization, which could challenge imperialism. He declared the disarming of all non-government organizations and warned that anyone advocating for armed resistance against the imperialist allies would be viewed as provocateurs and saboteurs. This announcement came just a day after the first Allied troops arrived, but before they could assert their control. In Hanoi, the DRV managed to survive, not through collaboration with the imperialists, but thanks to the divisions among the Allied powers. Roosevelt focused on supporting China, directing General Wedemeyer to curb any British and French political activities in his jurisdiction. In contrast, British General Gracie was ordered to liberate Allied territory, which essentially meant freeing land from the Vietnamese. To settle this dispute, the United States and Britain reached an agreement at the Potsdam Conference, dividing Vietnam at the 16th parallel between the Chinese operations in the north and Mountbatten's command in the south. De Gaulle, feeling powerless, was disappointed, realizing that this division severely undermined imperialist ambitions. Luckily for Ho, the Chinese were more preoccupied with their own exploitation than with maintaining a long-term occupation of North Vietnam, and they quietly acknowledged the Hanoi government. It was a different scenario in Cochinchina. The Vietnamese reminded General Gracie that they had fought side by side with the Allies against the fascists, but his reply was stark. "I was welcomed on arrival by the Viet Minh, who said welcome and similar pleasantries. It was a most unpleasant encounter, and I quickly expelled them. They were clearly communists." Gracie had no hesitation in heeding Mountbatten's directive to rely on the Japanese and French forces to enforce your orders. He enlisted a Japanese unit to help his Gurkhas remove the Provisional Executive Committee from their offices. On September 21st, he prohibited all demonstrations, processions, public gatherings, and the carrying of arms by the Vietnamese. The following day, under martial law, groups labeled by the Times as members of the French Maquis were unleashed in the southern capital. In reality, many were French soldiers and legionnaires tied to the Vichy regime from the Decoux era. Some were even Waffen-SS who had recently been freed from Japanese prisoner of war camps. They rampaged through the city, hurling insults, assaulting, detaining, and abusing any local they encountered. In retaliation, the Viet Minh declared a general strike, leading to open conflict. One eyewitness described how the crackle of gunfire and the thud of mortars soon echoed throughout the city, as armed Viet Minh squads launched attacks on the airport, set the central market ablaze, and stormed the local prison to free hundreds of Vietnamese inmates. Many French civilians lost their lives shortly after. Given the disorder among local French forces, Gracie withdrew them, awaiting the arrival of units from France on October 5th, and increasingly depended on the Japanese. They were put into combat roles, with the official history of the 20th Indian Division noting, "All the dirty work, to fight and disarm the Annamites, was assigned to the Japanese troops." Thus, an odd alliance of Allied victors and defeated Axis powers, Japanese jailers, and their jailed collaborators came together to remove Vietnamese rule in their homeland. By February 1946, British forces had suffered 40 soldiers lost, France 106, and Japan 110. In contrast, at least 3,026 Vietnamese were killed, 1,825 by the French, 651 by British forces, and 550 by the Japanese. The last British forces departed in March 1946, leaving the French in control south of the 16th parallel, intent on extending their power northward. Ho's attempt to balance between the two wars ultimately failed. His appeal to imperialism to support independence did not succeed. Although the delayed advocacy for mass mobilization led to victory in Hanoi, it meant that the enemy maintained control in the south. This contradiction between General Giap's hopes and his actual actions reflects the complexity of the situation. In early September 1945, he argued that the great powers in the Democratic Alliance were fighting for equality among nations, so it was unreasonable for them to assist French imperialism in repressing and exploiting the Vietnamese people. He insisted that after standing with the Allies against Japanese fascism in Indochina and contributing greatly to the Pacific struggle, they could not be expected to live under the oppressive rule of French colonialists, who had previously allowed Japan to occupy Indochina as a launch point for attacks on the Philippines, Malaya, Burma, and South China. Yet, This same leader orchestrated the remarkable defeat of the French army at Dien Phu in 1954 and subsequently saw the downfall of the Americans who followed. The 30-year Vietnam War emerged as a key anti-imperialist struggle of the 20th century and a powerful example of a people's war. The outcome was an independent nation, albeit governed by a dictatorial state capitalist regime. Many of the social and economic aspirations of common people went unmet during this process, and when faced with the choice of nationalism or socialism, the government firmly favored the former. In Vietnam, as in other places, the Second World War mixed political, social, and economic factors in ways that led to unexpected outcomes. Ho Chi Minh's early strategy of relying on various imperialist powers proved to be misguided, ultimately leading him to reluctantly accept that a people's war was the only way to achieve true independence. The war is won, but we small and subject countries have no share, or very, very small share, in the victory of freedom and democracy. Probably, if we wish to gain a meaningful share, we must continue to fight. The traditional understanding of the war against the Axis acknowledges the presence of official armies alongside resistance movements, encompassing generals and privates, the wealthy and the impoverished, yet it emphasizes their unity and shared efforts to eliminate the evils of Axis rule. However, the differences among participants weren't mere variations of a common goal. They represented fundamentally conflicting processes in terms of aims, ideology, tactics, and social structures. From 1939 to 1945, the existence of parallel wars was not the exception, but rather the norm, even if it wasn't universally recognized. The apparent unity simply masked deeper divisions, and the idea of the Second World War as a singular event is more of a convenient myth. A clear example of this disparity is the assumed common opposition to fascism. During the Spanish Civil War, the Western Allies favored Franco over the Republic, continuing their support for him even after the war ended. Hostilities with Germany only commenced after appeasement strategies failed to contain Hitler's territorial ambitions in Franco-British territories. Throughout and after the war, the Allies were willing to collaborate with Axis forces in indirect ways, like in the case of Darlan, the abandonment of the Warsaw Uprising, or the collaborationist militias in Greece, as well as directly by employing Japanese troops in Indonesia and Vietnam. Therefore, while seemingly intertwined, the people's fight against fascism did not align with the Allied government's war against the Axis. The conflicts also diverged in other significant ways. The ruling classes of the Allies sought to protect their privileged status from various threats, both internal and external, whereas popular armed struggles aimed for genuine human liberation and a more just democratic future. Imperialists indiscriminately sacrificed lives to achieve their goals, while partisans and guerrillas worked to protect local civilians and considered the risks posed by their actions. Conventional soldiers operated under a strict hierarchy, swearing to obey without question, while the fighters in the People's War, whether in Cairo's Soldiers' Parliament, Detroit's ghettos, or the mountains of Greece, Yugoslavia, and Italy, were aware volunteers driven by a strong ideological commitment. One might reasonably question whether labeling the Second World War as parallel wars on the Allied side isn't simply imposing a broad theoretical framework on a series of unrelated events. Why not, like many traditional histories, simply present the facts? Yet in doing so, they swing from labeling the entire 1939 to 1945 conflict with a single term to fragmenting this period into a collection of isolated incidents linked only by military actions. In truth, every historical event stands alone and resists direct comparison because conditions are never identical. General concepts often condense rich details into an analytical lens. Still, history, especially modern history, consists of interactions that aren't confined to one time or place, and these interactions can't be understood without a broader context. The Second World War serves as a striking example of this. It was, after all, the largest event in human history, fought across 6 of the 7 continents and all the oceans. Therefore, while examining specifics, exploring the connections among its many episodes reveals a deeper historical truth. The Second World War existed, and its core characteristics merit investigation. discovering parallel conflicts within it suggests that, using dialectical terminology, the Second World War embodied a unity of opposites. There's nothing surprising about the fact that different segments of society had diverse interests or behaved differently, nor that a formal declaration of war didn't eliminate these distinctions. What set the Second World War apart was that these tensions manifested as parallel wars rather than simply tensions within a singular conflict. To grasp why this is the case, it's important to look back at the long history of the state and warfare, arms, and the populace. During the Middle Ages, military power was decentralized. Barons commanded local forces with loose ties to the monarchy. Wars involved relatively small numbers due to limited transportation and weak central governance, which made assembling large national armies challenging. However, everything shifted in 1789 with the rise of the modern nation during the French Revolution, which championed liberty, equality, and fraternity. The notion of fraternity encompassed the idea that war, especially defensive wars, as all future conflicts would be deemed, was fought for the people, albeit with inherent ambiguity. This fraternity was embodied by the nascent nation-state that the masses rallied to protect from surrounding aristocracies. This very institution also served as a reflection of ruling class interests, described in Marx's Communist Manifesto as a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. When national states managed to fend off foreign oppression, they represented the interests of the masses. However, as tools of the ruling class, they shielded domestic capitalism from foreign rivals. The year 1789 marked a revolution in military organization. A close partnership between the French government and its citizens resisted the combined monarchies of Europe, leading to the concept of levée en masse. This mass mobilization, on an unprecedented scale, laid the groundwork for Napoleon's vast Grande Armée, which highlighted the advantages of large troop numbers, but also hit the technical limits of the time. Aristocratic mercenary forces fell before the might of Napoleonic tactics, and by 1812, his hundreds of thousands of troops triumphed over Russia at Borodino and took Moscow. Yet, stretched communication lines, harsh weather, and starvation ultimately led to the downfall of the Grande Armée. Only 90,000 returned, prompting Napoleon's reflection that an army marches on its stomach. The advancements in productive capacity hadn't kept up with destructive potential. The Industrial Revolution of the 19th century broke through those barriers. Railways now transported troops and supplies quickly, resulting in battles on an unprecedented scale, such as Gettysburg and Sadowa-Königgrätz, with 170,000 and 425,000 troops engaged, respectively. By the time of the First World War, Russia fielded an army of 16 million and Germany 13 million. Weapons also became increasingly lethal. Napoleonic muskets had a range of 150 yards and fired 2 rounds per minute, while First World War rifles could reach a mile at 10 rounds per minute, and machine guns could unleash 400. Casualties at the Battle of the Somme in 1916 totaled 9 million, with the British Army alone firing nearly 1 million shells that first day, weighing 40,000 tons. Total war, initiated by governments but sustained by entire populations on the home front, had arrived. During the French Revolution, it was uncertain whether the idea of national war for the people would be enduring, or if it was merely a response to a specific political situation, the life and death clash between the aristocracy and emerging progressive forces. In a perceptive remark from that era, Clausewitz pointed out that modern warfare had become an affair of the whole nation and had taken on a completely new character. He questioned whether all future wars in Europe would be fought with the full might of the states for significant interests that affected the populace, or if there would be a gradual return to a divide between government interests and those of the people. By the 20th century, the threat of the old regime had largely faded, and capitalism, now in its imperialist phase, was firmly entrenched. In Europe, nationalism was consistently exploited to split and control the working class. The exploitation by local capitalists was much like that by foreign ones, leading one to think that ordinary people might be less willing to sacrifice for their state. However, there was also a strong counterforce at play. The aggressive nature of capitalist competition and the states it created pushed many to rally behind their national governments against external threats. Thus, in 1914, Clausewitz's concerns about the relationship between the government and the people during wartime had yet to be resolved. The First World War erupted with intense fervor, highlighted by the well-known Kitchener recruitment poster that proclaimed, "Your country needs you." Yet by 1918, countless individuals would have echoed the Bolshevik assertion that official patriotism is a mask for the exploiting interests. The rift between the populace and their governments, as Clausewitz had anticipated, became evident through revolutions that toppled governments in Russia, Germany, and Austria. Simultaneously, in the victorious nations, mutinies, mass strikes, and factory occupations were widespread. The First World War did not give rise to a people's war alongside an imperialist one, but rather resulted in popular uprisings aimed at ending an imperialistic war. The Second World War would diverge significantly from the first in many aspects. Due to the haunting memories of the 1914 to 1918 conflict, the unfulfilled promises of post-war reforms, and the socio-economic crises of the interwar period, ordinary people were deeply affected. By 1939, Allied governments recognized that simplistic appeals to patriotism wouldn't resonate. Thus, in documents like the Atlantic Charter, they stressed the battle for freedom with even more urgency and made grand promises for post-war improvements. These efforts aimed to ignite public enthusiasm while preventing the chaos seen in 1917 to 1919. While the imperialist intentions of Allied governments remained unchanged, the public's expectations for liberation and reform had risen significantly compared to World War I and were harder to contain. Additionally, fascism and communism created a new ideological landscape. Fascism was a clear counter-revolutionary move aimed at dismantling working-class organization at home, along with a strategy of aggressive expansion that threatened established imperial powers. This fresh element motivated ordinary people to resist fascism and fight for their rights and freedoms. The second aspect wasn't new, marking World War II, like its predecessor, as another round of power struggles. Furthermore, there were key military distinctions. The First World War was characterized by large-scale trench warfare, resulting in relatively stable military fronts. In contrast, the blitzkrieg tactics of World War II made warfare more dynamic, subjecting millions to aerial attacks and enemy occupation. Germany and Japan deliberately shifted the burden of military expenses onto their conquered territories, resulting in famines and a scramble for manpower, which drove many young men to join partisan groups. The immediate threat of Axis aggression, from the London Blitz to direct occupation, meant that ordinary people felt compelled to take action rather than rely solely on government responses. Lastly, the Axis takeover of vast territories often led to the rise of collaborators. The ruling class's instinct for survival, combined with their desire to enlist the Gestapo against working-class movements, eroded the national illusion and challenged the ideological dominance that capitalism typically held. Even ruling classes that favored Allied imperialism dreaded mobilizing their own lower classes. The result was a stagnation that created room for new forces to emerge. In Asia, an additional factor was that the rapid Axis advance in Europe weakened colonial powers and opened up new paths to independence. In summary, alongside a violent imperialist conflict, the conditions were uniquely favorable for grassroots movements striving for national and social freedom. The extent to which the fighting from 1939 to 1945 surpassed a conventional defense of capitalism was not an anomaly, but rather a natural progression of earlier developments. The People's War had its flaws and strengths. As a blend of class and national identity, it was not sustainable in the long run. Often its forces quickly disbanded, as seen in Germany and France. Even in cases where they seized state power, like in Yugoslavia and Vietnam, the new governments tended to reinforce the national state as the administration of capitalism, turning the people into subjects of exploitation. The military impact of this movement on the Axis defeat is also open to discussion. Keegan may be too harsh in his assessment that the contributions of resistance movements to the Allied victory were minimal and should be considered by any objective measure as irrelevant and futile acts of bravado. In January 1944, Yugoslav partisans were engaging 15 German divisions, and during D-Day, the French resistance hindered 12 divisions. Yet these accomplishments seem small compared to the hundreds of divisions deployed by Allied forces, who benefited from taxation, financial resources, arms manufacturing, and the power of well-equipped conventional armies. However, the People's War was not limited to just resistance groups. Millions in conventional armies were committed to confronting Axis tyranny, and by extension, oppression in general. This was clearly recognized by the Allied governments, who all embraced the mantle of anti-fascism. Overy rightly asserts that for ordinary people everywhere, the belief that they were fighting on the side of righteousness equipped them with a significant moral advantage. This conviction was directed against Germany, Italy, and Japan, but could just as easily be applied to the Allies. When asked whether the Second World War was an imperialist conflict or a people's struggle, the response is that it was both. However, the balance between the two varied significantly across different regions, influenced in part by subjective factors such as the communists' involvement. While the Hitler-Stalin Pact was active, the Communist parties condemned the Second World War as an imperialist conflict. However, after Operation Barbarossa, they quickly transitioned to leading the People's War. Their association with the victorious Red Army boosted their appeal. The Communists were driven by a sincere dedication to social progress and justice, even though their leaders' strict loyalty to Moscow often harmed the very movements they helped to create. It's crucial to recognize that the People's War was not simply a communist scheme. It included a variety of movements, such as the Quit India struggle, which the Indian Communist Party opposed, the Warsaw Insurgents, and the Double Vive campaign in the United States. Various objective factors also influenced the situation. Countries caught between imperialist powers like Yugoslavia, Greece, Poland, and Latvia exhibited varying dynamics involving People's War and imperialist conflict. In Yugoslavia, Mihailovich feared the partisans more than the enemy and collaborated with them, leaving the British and Russians no choice but to support Tito's partisans as the only force resisting the Axis. Thus, People's War and imperialist forces occasionally aligned. In Greece, the EAM-ELAS, influenced by communism, received some backing from the Allies. However, following the Percentages Agreement that placed Greece firmly in the British sphere, Churchill bombed Athens and reinstated the oppressive monarchy. Here, the clash between the two wars was fierce and violent. In Poland, Stalin's ruthless tactics combined with the indiscriminate Nazi violence brought those loyal to imperialism together with the broader population for a united cause. This culminated in the Warsaw Uprising, which reflected both wars, yet was ultimately left behind by Stalin in the face of German retaliation. Latvia was caught between two warring imperialist factions, leading its population to align with one of these dreadful choices. Thus, a People's War never emerged. In the heartlands of the Allied nations, it often became difficult to distinguish between those fighting fascism and those upholding empires. In the United States, the divide was marked by racial tensions, resulting in riots and violent confrontations domestically. In Britain, the 1945 general election revealed a clear division, showing that the general public and the ruling class were engaged in separate, parallel conflicts. The most significant divide appeared in France, where the ruling class was divided between de Gaulle and Pétain, yet an independent resistance emerged. In Axis countries, conditions were generally less favorable for parallel conflicts. In Germany, opposition from the ruling class surfaced only when their imperial interests were threatened, and it did not embrace a people's war. Moreover, stringent repression stifled grassroots action, which could only arise once the Nazi regime was dismantled from outside. Thus, the two wars became portrayed as a confrontation between the Allies and the Antifa resistance. A similar dynamic could have occurred in Austria, but the Allies, aiming to detach it from Germany, associated its ruling class, tainted by fascism and collaboration, with the anti-Nazi cause. This made it challenging for a people's war to gain traction there. Italy stood out as an exception, as Mussolini's grip loosened before the Allies reached the north, allowing the People's War to mount a significant challenge against both the Nazi occupiers and their local collaborators. Though General Alexander nearly proposed that the Nazis eliminate the CLNA, which dissolved swiftly after the war's conclusion, the Italian resistance left an enduring political impact. In Asia, the dynamics between imperialist war and people's war were influenced by the declining power of European colonial rulers and Japan's deceptive claims of being anti-imperialist. In India, resistance manifested either as a direct anti-colonialist movement, Quit India, or as a strategy to leverage Japanese support to oust Britain, the Indian National Army. After some initial doubts from Sukarno, Indonesia's People's War involved armed confrontations with all the imperialist forces present, Japanese, British, and Dutch. The Vietnamese Communist Party sought backing from the Allies, but, after being denied, engaged in grassroots mobilization to forge a strong anti-imperialist movement. Ultimately, the Second World War was unlike any other. It unleashed unspeakable horrors, the Holocaust, nuclear devastation, widespread famine, and immense civilian casualties, but it is also remembered as the Good War that vanquished Nazism and fascism. As Clausewitz indicated, warfare transcends mere tactics. It reflects deeper political trends, and these dual aspects of the Second World War continued to resonate after 1945. Let's take a moment to flip his saying. In times of peace, politics continues the fight, just in a different way. Even when the guns went quiet, competition between empires persisted, leading to the Cold War. Meanwhile, the people's struggle evolved into a powerful, sometimes fierce fight for decolonization, along with efforts to create welfare states and improve living conditions. In the 21st century, these issues remain relevant. Imperialism continues through interventions in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, along with a domestic assault on living standards driven by economic crises. Thankfully, the spirit of the people's struggle is still alive in the fight against imperialist wars, racism, and fascism, as well as in defending the welfare systems established after 1945. As one Second World War veteran recently noted, the resistance emerged during a critical time in history. People had to respond to an intolerable situation. But today, we too face intolerable conditions, and we need to respond in the same way.